I'm Pat Courtney with JTEKT, and we're going to learn about cage and needle roller bearings. So what is a cage and needle roller bearing? Well, it's real simple. It's a cage with rollers. So, and what is a cage? So we hear the name cage, we hear the name retainer, we hear the name separator. So a cage is actually a device that retains the rollers in both directions. So I can shake this, and the bearing rollers do not fall out toward the shaft, and they can't be pushed out away from the shaft. There are some retainers that will retain the rollers in one direction, like in a drawn cup bearing. So they're going to retain the rollers from falling into the shaft, but they will not retain the rollers from going outward. So that's the basic design. That's what a cage is designed to do, is retain it in both directions. Now, with a cage and roller bearing, we're going to be using needle rollers. What are those rollers made out of? 52-100, just like all of our other rolling elements. What does the cage also do? In the case of a cage and roller, it's gonna actually steer or guide those rollers. So normally in a ball bearing, you have a race that's guiding those balls around, or in a cylindrical roller bearing, you have those flanges that come down that guide the rollers. The cage is the only device here that's going to keep those rollers aligned and forward. So a lot of times with a cage and roller product, it's not going to be a stamped, it's going to be more of a robust cage. It's going to be thicker, so it can actually guide those rollers. So the other main purpose of the cage is to stop the rollers from rubbing against each other as well. So it guides the rollers, but it separates the rolling elements. And whether that be in a needle roller bearing or other type of bearing, it separates those rolling elements from rubbing up against each other, which generates an excessive amount of heat. So the rollers are 52-100 steel, just like all of our rolling elements. The cage itself can be made out of steel or plastic. It depends on the application. So what size range do we make these? Anywhere from a 5mm bore all the way up to a 200mm bore. They also come in inch sizes as well. So it's designed to take a radial load, of course. So cage and rollers cannot take any thrust load. There's nothing to retain those rollers. And if they're needle bearings, the ends of those rollers are not machined or ground. So why use cage and roller needle bearing? Again, very thin cross section, a good power dense solution to carry a high radial load in a very small area. So if I were to try to carry the same amount of radial load with a ball bearing, I might need a much larger ball bearing to carry the same amount of radial load as a cage and roller. Because it's a roller versus a ball, it can carry more load, okay, but it's a very thin cross section. It's a unitized assembly, so the cage obviously holds the rollers. In some applications, customers will try to put a full complement of rollers in, so by jamming in a bunch of rollers with no cage, it's nice to have the cage because it holds everything together. So if there's an application that's using a high volume of these, we can make these cages in higher volume, and obviously the rollers we can make in higher volumes, so it lowers the cost. Now, we can also make these with a split design, where we can actually split the two bearings in half, and that's going to make it a lot easier for assembly. So if we already have a shaft in an assembly and we have to get a needle bearing underneath a certain spot, we can, instead of having to slide it on from the end, we can clip two halves together and put it into the spot that we want. So they're available that way as well. The most popular applications are planetary systems in automotive, construction, and agricultural vehicles. So in a planetary, what a planetary is a bunch of series of gears that are all touching each other and they're spinning. So you have small gears and a large gear, and that allows us to input different speeds and torque and generate different inputs and speeds and torque depending on that gear arrangement. Well, those gears are supported by a shaft, and on the end of that shaft, it's going to be inside that, on that shaft is going to be your cage and roller bearing, and that gear bore, so the bore of that gear is going to be machined and ground and heat treated to take one of these cage and rollers. Planetaries tend to be very compact systems, so you need something with very thin cross section to fit all of those gears and shafts and everything into a small area, especially in an automotive or even a heavy-duty construction or agricultural type piece of equipment. You're going to have to compact that system, so you need a thin cross-section bearing to go in there. Where else are they used? Automotive and marine engines and transmissions, robotics, EV axles. So these new electrical vehicle axles will be using some planetaries that will involve using some cage and roller product. Aerospace applications for flight controls, landing gear, actuator systems, and engine control systems in your aerospace. So in summary, the cage and needle roller bearings are designed for high radial loads with a thin cross-section and in their high volumes at low cost. I hope you enjoyed this peek into cage and needle roller bearings. Stay tuned for more bearing training from JTEKT, formerly known as Koyo.